Before we begin, if you enjoy tales of noblemen who talk themselves into trouble, and wars they never meant to fight, consider subscribing to You Nightfall Notions for more boring bedtime stories. The kind that lull you not with sweetness, but with the dry, absurd weight of history's least fortunate soul. Chapter 1. The Boastful Nobleman. The court of Duke Orsino was a place where truth went to die gracefully, smothered in silk and flattery. Every nobleman worth his salt knew that the real battles were not fought on fields, but in the flickering candlelight of banquet halls, where reputations were carved not with swords, but with well-told lies. And among these liars none shone brighter, or more recklessly, than Lord Edric of Blackmore. Edric was a man of middling stature, unremarkable in both face and fencing, but he possessed a gift more lethal than any blade, an uncanny ability to spin the dullest skirmish into a saga worthy of legend. His exploits, as recounted over goblets of spiced wine, grew taller with each telling. A scuffle with bandits became a desperate last stand against a horde of mercenaries. A hunting mishap, a misplaced arrow striking a boar somewhat off target, transformed into a heroic duel with a beast of mythic proportions. The court adored him for it. After all, what was nobility without a little embellishment? One evening, as the fire crackled and the wine flowed freely, Edric found himself the center of attention once more. The Duke, a man whose patience for flattery was matched only by his love of war stories, leaned forward in his gilded chair. "Come, Edric," he said, his voice thick with indulgence. "Tell us again of your victory at Greymarsh. I never tire of hearing how you held the bridge alone against 20 men. Edric, warmed by wine and the eager eyes upon him, did not hesitate. He straightened his embroidered doublet and began. "Ah, Greymarsh, a bleak and bloody day, my lord. The rain fell in sheets, the mud sucking at our boots like the grasp of the damned. My men, brave souls, everyone, had fallen or fled. Only I remained, my sword notched, my shield splintered, 20 seasoned killers, advise gleaming with—" A murmur of admiration rippled through the court. The Duke's gaze, however, had sharpened. 20 men, you say? A remarkable feat. I've half a mind to test such skill in earnest. Edric, mistaking danger for flattery, grinned. My lord is too kind, though I confess even 20 seems a modest number now. In truth, it might have been 30. The chaos of battle blurs such details. The Duke's smile did not waver, but something in his eyes turned cold. 30. How fortunate for the realm to have such a warrior in its midst. He lifted his goblet in a toast, and the court followed suit, though a few of the sharper nobles exchanged glances. A week later, the summons arrived. Edric, still basking in the afterglow of his latest performance, broke the seal with a flourish. The message was brief. When Duke Orsino commands your presence at the mustering field at dawn. The borderlands are in turmoil, and men of proven valor are needed to lead the charge. Edric's stomach dropped. The borderlands were a nest of real brigands, the kind who didn't care for flowery speeches or noble blood. Worse yet, the Duke had named him Gigi Captain of the Vanguard, an honor surely, but one that required actual fighting. Panic set in. He had never so much as commanded a squad, let alone a company. His battles had been tavern brawls at best. But to refuse the Duke's call was unthinkable. His reputation, his standing, all of it hinged on the illusion he had so carefully crafted. That night, as Edric stared at his untouched supper, his steward ventured a question. My lord, shall I prepare your armor? The black steel with the gold engraving? Edric swallowed hard. Yes, and send for a fencing master, at once. The steward hesitated. At this hour, Edric snapped. Then, quieter, and discreetly, no one must know. As the steward hurried off, Edric slumped into his chair. The weight of his lies pressed down on him like a suit of ill-fitting mail. Dawn was coming, and with it, the reckoning he had so artfully avoided. Somewhere in the distance a owl hooted, a sound that in another tale might have been ominous. But in this one it was merely a bird, indifferent to the plight of a nobleman who had talked his way into a war he could not win. Chapter 2. The King's Summons. The fencing master arrived well past midnight, bleary-eyed and unimpressed. He took one look at Edric's tentative grip on the practice blade and sighed. "My lord, have you ever held a sword before today?" Edric bristled. "Of course I have. I've slain 30 men at Grey Marsh, as the whole court knows." The fencing master rubbed his temples. 30 men, right. Let's start with not cutting off your own foot." 3 sleepless nights later, Edric could at least parry without squealing. It was not much, but it was something. His steward, ever dutiful, had polished his armor until it gleamed, more for show than for function, given that Edric had never worn it in actual combat. It was uncomfortably heavy, like being embraced by an overly enthusiastic bear. On the morning of the muster, the Duke's herald arrived with a new message. This one bore not the Duke's seal, but the royal crest. Edric's hands trembled as he broke the wax. The words within were curt. "The order of His Majesty King Aldric, Lord Edric of Blackmoor, is summoned to the capital with all haste. His renowned valor is required for the defense of the realm." Dance. The steward paled. The king himself? Edric's mouth had gone dry. The Duke's little game was one thing, courtly posturing, easily navigated with the right mix of groveling and charm. But the king? The king did not indulge in flattery. The king had actual wars to fight. The journey to the capital was a blur of jostling carriage rides and mounting dread. Edric rehearsed 6 excuses, each more improbable than the last. Perhaps he could claim a sudden illness, or a divine vision forbidding him from battle. Better yet, a tragic injury sustained on the road, something heroic, but conveniently incapacitating. But the royal guards waiting at the city gates gave him no opportunity for such theatrics. They escorted him directly to the throne room, where King Aldric sat like a storm cloud given human form. The king was not an old man, but his face was lined with the kind of weariness that came from years of real war, not the silk-cushioned variety Edric was accustomed to. His gaze pinned Edric where he stood. "Ah, the hero of Grey Marsh. I've heard tales of your exploits. 30 men, was it?" Edric bowed deeply, his mind racing. "Your Majesty honors me with your attention, though in truth, the numbers matter little. A knight's duty is to stand firm, whatever the odds." The king's expression did not change. "Indeed, which is why you will lead the vanguard against the Valtieri raiders in the northern passes. They've burned 3 villages already. I need a man who doesn't balk at uneven odds." Edric's stomach lurched. The Valtieri were not bandits or disorganized mercenaries. They were a disciplined force of mountain warriors who reportedly bathed in the blood of their enemies and decorated their spears with the skulls of past commanders. Even the king's seasoned generals spoke of them with grudging respect. "Your Majesty is too kind," Edric managed. "But surely there are others more experienced." The king cut him off with a raised hand. "Modesty ill becomes a warrior of your reputation. The men need a leader who inspires them, someone who has faced impossible odds and lived to tell the tale. Who better than you?" There was no malice in the king's voice, only the cool certainty of a man who had long ago stopped questioning the obedience of his subjects. Edric opened his mouth, then closed it. To refuse now would be to admit his lies, an act that would cost him not just his standing, but likely his head. The king leaned forward slightly. "You leave at dawn. My marshals will provide you with the details." Dismissed. Back in his borrowed quarters, Edric stared at the campaign maps spread across the table. The northern passes were a maze of narrow trails and ambush points, the kind of terrain where even seasoned troops could be picked apart. And he was to lead raw recruits, men who no doubt had heard his heroics and expected miracles. His steward entered quietly, bearing a cup of wine. "My lord, perhaps it's not too late to clarify certain exaggerations?" Edric took the cup and drained it in one gulp. "And admit I've been lying to the king's face? No, there's only one way out of this now." The steward waited. Edric set down the cup with a hollow thud. Victory, or a very convincing death. That night, the capital's bells tolled the hour as Edric lay awake, listening to the distant clatter of the armory, preparing for war. Somewhere in the city, a dog barked and a child cried out in its sleep. Life went on, indifferent to the fate of one nobleman who had spun his stories too well. Dawn came too soon. The muster yard was a chaos of shouting sergeants and clanking steel. The men assigned to Edric's command eyed him with a mix of awe and desperation. They had heard the stories. They believed in him. Edric mounted his horse, his armor gleaming in the pale morning light. He raised his hand in what he hoped was an inspiring gesture. "Forward, brave souls, to glory!" The cheer that followed was deafening. As they rode out of the gates, Edric allowed himself one private, bitter laugh. He had spent years crafting the perfect lie. Now, at last, he would learn what it cost. Chapter 3. The Reluctant General. The road north was a slow march into misery. Edric had imagined war as a grand procession of banners and glory, not this interminable slog through mud and biting wind. His armor, so splendid in the capital, now felt like a portable dungeon. The men, his men, gods help them, trudged along with a mix of enthusiasm and exhaustion, their faith in him evident in the way they glanced his way whenever the path grew steep or the rations ran thin. They expected leadership. They expected strategy. Edric had neither. Their first night in the field, the camp was a mess of half-pitched tents and wandering soldiers. The sergeants, hardened men who had actually seen battle, watched Edric with thinly veiled skepticism as he stood before his command tent, pretending to study a map he barely understood. One of them, a grizzled veteran named Torval, finally cleared his throat. "My lord, the scouts report the Valtieri are burning farms near the Red Fork crossing. We could intercept them by morning if we—" "Yes, yes," Edric interrupted, waving a hand as if the matter were trivial. "But let us not rush blindly into battle. Strategy is paramount." Torval's eyebrow twitched. "Of course, my lord. What strategy would you suggest?" Edric's mind raced. He had once described a fictional battle in such vivid detail that a visiting diplomat had wept. Now, faced with the real thing, his thoughts were as coherent as a drunkard's song. "We shall divide our forces. Yes, a feint to lure them into an ambush." Torvald blinked. "An ambush? In open farmland?" "Precisely." Edric nodded sagely. "They will never expect it." The sergeants exchanged glances. Torvald exhaled slowly. "My lord, with respect, the Red Fork is flat as a griddle. There's nowhere to hide an ambush party." Edric's smile felt brittle. "Ah, but that is where you were mistaken. The best hiding place is the one no one thinks to look for." This meant nothing. It was the kind of empty, poetic nonsense that played well at court. Torvald's expression suggested he was seriously considering desertion. Just then, a young soldier burst into the tent. His face flushed. "My lord, Valtieri riders spotted less than a league east." The tent erupted into chaos. Sergeants barked orders. Men scrambled for weapons. Edric, meanwhile, stood frozen, his carefully crafted persona crumbling under the weight of actual danger. This was not a story. There would be no dramatic pauses, no convenient twists of fate. People were about to die, and it would be his fault. Torvald grabbed his arm. "My lord, we need orders. Do we form up? Retreat? What's the plan?" Edric's mouth moved before his brain could stop it. "I shall lead the charge myself." The words hung in the air, like a death sentence. Torvald's grip tightened. "My lord, you can't be serious. You're the commander. If you fall—" "If I fall," Edric said with a bravado he did not feel, "then you may write ballads about my bravery." Outside, the camp was a frenzy of motion. Men strapped on helmets, tested bowstrings, muttered prayers. Edric mounted his horse, his knees shaking so badly he nearly slipped from the saddle. The troops formed up around him, their faces a mix of fear and determination. They believed in him. They really did. The Valtieri emerged from the tree line like shadows given form. They rode lean horses, their armor stitched with bones and strange symbols. Their leader, a towering figure with a face obscured by a horned helm, raised a spear and let out a ululating cry that sent a shiver down Edric's spine. This was it. No more lies. No more stories. Edric drew his sword, an ornate thing, more decoration than weapon, and opened his mouth to give what he hoped would be a rousing speech. Then his horse bolted. Whether from panic or some equine sense of impending doom, the beast took off like an arrow, charging straight for the Valtieri line. Edric clung to the saddle, his scream lost in the sudden roar of battle. Behind him, his men, mistaking this for some mad act of courage, surged forward with a shout. The Valtieri hesitated. No sane commander led from the front like this. It was either genius or insanity. They leveled their spears, bracing for impact. Edric closed his eyes. Then the world exploded in noise and motion. An arrow whizzed past his ear. His horse veered sharply, throwing him into the mud just short of the enemy line. He rolled, gasping, his armor clanking like a dropped kettle. When he looked up, it was to the sight of his own men crashing into the Valtieri with surprising force. The enemy, unprepared for such a reckless assault, wavered. Torvald appeared beside him, holding him to his feet. "My lord, you mad bastard," he panted. "It's working." Edric, too stunned to speak, could only nod. By some miracle, or perhaps sheer confusion, the Valtieri broke. They retreated into the trees, leaving behind a handful of wounded. The field was theirs. The men cheered. They clapped Edric on the back, their voices full of awe. "You led the charge yourself," one cried. "Like something out of the old tales." Torvald shook his head, grinning. "Never seen anything like it. You've got stones, my lord. I'll give you that." Edric, still trembling, managed a weak smile. His heart pounded so violently he feared it might burst. He had done nothing. Absolutely nothing. And yet here they were, calling him a hero. As the men celebrated, he staggered to the edge of the field, his legs barely holding him. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bloody hues. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed. He had survived. Worse, he had succeeded. And now there was no going back. Chapter 4. Marching to Disaster. The victory at Red Fork Crossing should have been a fluke, a stroke of luck so absurd that even the gods might have chuckled at it. Yet somehow it had only cemented Edric's reputation. The men now looked at him with something beyond mere respect, something dangerously close to reverence. They spoke in hushed tones about his fearless charge, his unorthodox tactics, his unerring instinct for battle. Edric wanted to scream. Instead, he found himself standing before a new map in his command tent, surrounded by officers who actually knew what they were doing, all waiting for his next brilliant strategy. The problem was, Edric didn't have one. He'd hoped that the skirmish at Red Fork would be the end of it, that the Valtieri would retreat, the king would be satisfied, and he could return to court with a modest but believable tale of heroism. But no. The king had sent fresh orders: press the advantage, drive the Valtieri from the northern passes. Peace. So here they were, marching deeper into hostile territory, and Edric was running out of ways to pretend he knew what he was doing. The army moved at a sluggish pace, slowed by supply wagons and the inevitable chaos of poorly coordinated troops. The further they traveled from the capital, the more the landscape turned against them, thick forests giving way to rocky hills, the paths growing narrower, the air colder. The men, still buoyed by their first victory, sang marching songs and boasted about the riches they would claim from the defeated Valtieri. Edric did not share their optimism. Every rustle in the trees made him flinch. Every scout's report made his stomach clench. He had begun to suspect that the sergeants were deliberately keeping the worst news from him, as one might shield a child from unpleasant truths. On the third day of the march, Torval approached him as he pretended to inspect a rust stain on his gauntlet. "My lord," the sergeant said, his voice carefully neutral, "the scouts report a Valtieri warband ahead. They're dug in near the old watchtower at Blackridge. Defensible position. If we press on, we'll have to engage them by nightfall." Edric swallowed. How many? 200, maybe more. Against their 500. Not impossible odds in theory. But Edric had read enough actual military treatises in his panicked late-night studies to know that numbers meant little if you didn't know how to use them. He stroked his chin, buying time. "What do the other sergeants suggest?" Torval hesitated. "They believe we should flank them, send a detachment through the eastern gully to hit them from behind while the main force advances head-on." "That sounds reasonable," Edric said weakly. Torval's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "It's the obvious move, my lord. The kind of thing the Valtieri will expect." "Ah? Of course." Edric had forgotten the first rule of lying about battles. Always make it sound like you've outfought the enemy. He straightened. "Then we shall do the opposite. We will feign a retreat. Lure them into the open." Torval stared at him. "A feigned retreat, with green troops, against an enemy that knows the terrain better than we do." Edric's mouth was dry. "Yes." For a long moment, Torval said nothing. Then, very slowly, he nodded. "As you command, my lord." The moment he left, Edric collapsed onto his campaign stool, his hands shaking. He had just ordered 500 men into a maneuver he didn't understand, against an enemy he couldn't defeat, in a land he didn't know. This wasn't just incompetence. This was a recipe for massacre. But it was too late to take it back. The orders were given. The men, confused but obedient, began preparations for the stratagem. The advance scouts were called back. The supply wagons were rearranged to look like a retreating column. All the while, Edric could feel the weight of the sergeant's stares, the unspoken question hanging in the air. "What in the hells are you doing?" "Geise, Linden, Ganz und Davi, Luceto Pitamania, Yani." As dusk fell, the first signs of disaster appeared. The Valtieri did not take the bait. Instead of pursuing the retreating force, they held their position, watching. Then, just as the last light faded, their horns sounded, not from ahead, but from the sides. They had flanked Uaning. The camp erupted into chaos. Mayen shouted, scrambling for weapons. Arrows hissed out of the darkness, thudding into tents and earth. Someone screamed as a horse bolted through the firelight. Its rider slumped over its neck. Edric stood frozen, his mind blank. This was it. This was how the lie ended, not with a grand last stand, but with a confused slaughter in the dark. Torval appeared at his side, blood streaking his face. "My lord, we need to rally the men." Edric opened his mouth, but no words came. Torval gripped his arm, his grip like iron. "Now, damn you, they're looking to you." Somehow, that broke the spell. Edric stumbled forward toward the fray, his sword in hand. He had no plan, no clever stratagem, just the dawning, horrifying realization that if these men were going to die, they would at least die looking at him. The night swallowed them all. Chapter 5. The First Blunder. Chaos had a sound, Edric realized. A cacophony of clashing steel, panicked shouts, and the wet thud of arrows finding flesh. The Valtieri struck like shadows given malice, their attacks precise where his men's defenses were not. The camp's perimeter had collapsed within minutes, the hastily arranged barricades nothing more than kindling beneath the enemy's advance. Edric stood rooted in place, his sword dangling uselessly at his side. He had imagined battle 100 times, had described it in lavish detail to rapt audiences, but none of his stories had included this. The smell of blood and sweat, the way torchlight flickered across terrified faces, the sheer overwhelming certainty that he was about to die. A hand seized his shoulder, yanking him backward, just as a spear whistled past his face. Torvald's voice cut through the din like a blade. "Move, damn you!" Edric stumbled, his legs finally obeying. Torvald shoved him toward a cluster of soldiers forming a ragged shield wall. "Get behind them. Now!" "But, no time," Torvald bellowed. Then to the men, close ranks, archers loose at will. Edric had never given an order that was actually followed. Torvald's were obeyed instantly. Arrows flew into the darkness, their aim indiscriminate but their effect immediate. The Valtieri's advance faltered, their silhouettes melting back into the night. For a breathless moment, there was silence. Then the wounded began to moan. Torvald rounded on Edric, his face a mask of fury barely restrained. What in the seven hells was that? Edric opened his mouth, but no excuse came. "We lost 20 men," Torvald hissed. 20. If you thought a feigned retreat would work with troops who've never held a line, let alone pretended to break one. I save it. Torvald's glare could have melted steel. The men still think you've got some grand plan. So either you start leading, or I'll personally make sure your next heroic charge ends with a Valtieri spear in your gut. Edric had no doubt he meant it. The camp was a ruin. Tents smoldered. The wounded lay in rows, their cries a constant, ghastly chorus. The surviving soldiers watched Edric as he passed, their expressions a mix of hope and exhaustion. They still believed in him. That was the worst part. Dawn brought no respite. The Valtieri had withdrawn, but the scouts reported they were regrouping in the hills, preparing for another strike. Edric's officers gathered in what remained of the command tent, their faces grim. Torvald spoke first. "We can't stay here. They'll pick us apart." A murmur of agreement. Then all eyes turned to Edric. He cleared his throat. "Then we move. Take the high ground. Somewhere defensible." One of the younger lieutenants frowned. "The only high ground nearby is the old watchtower, but it's half collapsed, no water, no cover." Edric grasped at the first thought that came to him. "Exactly. They won't expect us there. We'll fortify what's left of the tower, make them come to us." The officers exchanged glances. It was madness. The tower was a death trap. Torvald studied Edric for a long moment. Then to the others, "You heard the Lord. Ready the men." As the officers dispersed, Torvald leaned in, his voice low. "If this gets them killed, I won't wait for the Valtieri to finish you." Edric nodded. The march to the watchtower was a somber affair. The men, their initial enthusiasm long since drained, trudged in silence. The tower loomed ahead, a skeletal ruin jutting from the rocky hillside. It was worse than Edric had imagined. Crumbling walls, no roof, and a single narrow staircase that looked ready to collapse under the weight of a stray thought. Torvald surveyed the site with a soldier's eye. "We can hold the staircase, barely. But if they surround us—" Edric said nothing. There was nothing to say. The men set to work, barricading what they could, piling rubble into makeshift barriers. Edric pretended to oversee them, his mind racing. He had led them into this. Somehow, he had to lead them out. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the horn sounded again. The Valtieri came in force this time, their numbers a dark tide against the hillside. Edric stood atop the broken tower, his hands gripping the uneven stone. Below, his men braced, their shields locked, their faces pale but determined. Torvald climbed to join him, his expression unreadable. They'll hit us from all sides. We can't hold. Edric stared at the advancing enemy. Then, abruptly, he laughed. Torvald blinked. My lord. Edric pointed. Look at their formation. They're not expecting a fight. They think we're already beaten. Torvald followed his gaze. The Valtieri were advancing in loose ranks, their weapons at ease. They hadn't even bothered to form proper lines. Edric's mind, for the first time in weeks, was clear. They think we're cornered, desperate, so we give them desperation. Torvald's eyes narrowed. What are you thinking? Edric grinned. It was the same grin he'd used 100 times at court, right before spinning some impossible tale. We charged them. Torvald opened his mouth, closed it. Then, slowly, he smiled. The order went out. The men, bewildered but obedient, formed up. Edric stood at their head, his borrowed sword raised. You've heard the stories, he called, his voice carrying in the twilight. Now let's give them a new one. And with that, he ran straight at the enemy. The Valtieri, caught mid-advance, barely had time to react. Their lines wavered. Their shouts turned to confusion. Then Edric's men hit them like a hammer, their momentum carrying them straight through the unprepared ranks. It wasn't skill. It wasn't strategy. It was pure, stupid audacity. And it worked. The Valtieri broke. Some fought. Most fled. By the time the dust settled, the hillside was littered with abandoned weapons and the distant echoes of retreating footsteps. Edric stood amidst the chaos, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Around him the men cheered, their voices raw with triumph. Torvald clapped him on the back, his grip firm. That, he said, was the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Edric laughed. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't forced. The lie had nearly killed them all. But somehow, against all odds, it had also saved them. For now. Chapter 6. The Soldier's Whisper. Victory, as it turned out, was a fickle companion. The rout at the watchtower had bought them time, but not safety. The Valtieri still lurked in the hills, and the men, though buoyed by their unexpected triumph, now marched with a wary edge to their step. They had followed Edric's mad charge without question, but questions were beginning to form. Edric noticed it first in the way the younger soldiers looked at him, not with outright doubt, but with a hesitation that hadn't been there before. The veterans were worse. They didn't stare. They didn't whisper. They simply went quiet when he passed, their conversations dying like embers doused with water. It was Torvald who confirmed his fears. 3 nights after the battle, the sergeant found him hunched over a campfire, poking at the flames with a stick. You've got trouble, Torvald said without preamble. Edric didn't pretend to misunderstand. What are they saying? That you're lucky. That luck runs out. Torvald spat into the fire. Some are saying worse. Worse? That you don't know what you're doing. Edric barked a laugh, though it lacked any real humor. Well, they're not wrong. Torvald studied him for a long moment. You're not what I expected, my lord. What did you expect? A fraud. A preening peacock who'd get us all killed for his own pride. Torvald shrugged. You're still a fraud, but you're not a peacock. Edric wasn't sure whether to be insulted or flattered. What am I, then? Don't know yet. Torvald turned to leave, then paused. But the men need to believe you're something, or this army falls apart. The truth of it settled over Edric like a leaden cloak. He had spent years crafting a persona, but personas were for courtiers and poets, not commanders in the field. Out here, men followed strength. Or, failing that, certainty. He had neither. The next morning, the rumors took a darker turn. A group of soldiers had gathered near the supply wagons, their voices low but sharp. Edric caught only fragments as he passed. Never seen him train with the rest. Claims he fought at Grey Marsh, but old Harold was there, says no nobleman. Heard from a groom in the capital, says he couldn't even ride properly before. The words slithered through the camp like poison. By midday, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. Orders were obeyed, but slowly. Eyes lingered too long on his back. Even the sergeants seemed to be waiting, watching, measuring the weight of his authority against the growing tide of doubt. Edric had faced scorn at court before. He had been mocked, belittled, dismissed as a harmless braggart. But this was different. These men's lives depended on him, and they were starting to realize he had nothing to give them. That evening, as he sat alone in his tent, a folded scrap of parchment was slipped under the flap. The handwriting was crude, the message brief. "Ze no ti no pa nesel no de vaning tenumus pavatamo titeria." Sherry. No signature. No threat. Just those two words, heavy with implication. Edric stared at them until the letters blurred. Then he burned the note in the candle's flame and sat in the dark, listening to the camp's restless murmur. He had always known the lie would catch up to him. He just hadn't expected it to come from his own men. Dawn brought no clarity. The army packed up with sullen efficiency, their movements sluggish, their voices muted. Edric moved among them like a ghost, offering nods and half-hearted encouragement that fell on stony ground. It was Torval who finally forced the issue. As the column formed up, he pulled Edric aside, his grip tight on his arm. "We need to talk, now." They walked a short distance from the others, far enough to be out of earshot. Torvald didn't mince words. "There's going to be a challenge." Edric's stomach lurched. From who? Does it matter? Some hothead with something to prove. If you refuse, you lose face. If you accept? Torvald's expression was grim. "Well, you're not exactly a duelist, are you?" Edric's mind raced. He had fenced exactly twice in his life, once as a boy when he'd been soundly thrashed by his tutor, and once in those panic nights before leaving the capital. Neither experience had left him with any illusions about his skill. "What do I do?" Torvald exhaled through his nose. "You're the commander. Command." "That's not helpful." "It's all I've got." Torvald's gaze was unflinching. "The men need to see you lead. Really lead. Not just stumble into victories." Edric opened his mouth to reply, but a commotion cut him off. A cluster of soldiers had gathered near the front of the column, their voices raised. At their center stood a broad-shouldered infantryman named Cale, his face flushed with anger. "Had enough of this," Cale was saying, his voice carrying. "We're being led by a damned court jester." Edric didn't think. He strode forward, Torvald at his heels. The men parted as he approached, their expressions a mix of apprehension and anticipation. Cale turned to face him, his chin jutting defiantly. "My lord," he said, the title dripping with scorn. Edric kept his voice calm. "Is there a problem?" "The problem is you." Cale's hand rested on his sword hilt. "We've been following your orders, but some of us are starting to wonder. Who are you really? What have you actually done?" The challenge hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Edric could feel the eyes upon him, the weight of their expectation. He could refuse. He could order Cale disciplined. He could try to bluff his way through, or he could do something truly stupid. He unbuckled his sword belt and let it fall to the ground. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cale blinked, thrown. "What?" "You're right," Edric said, loud enough for all to hear. "I'm not what you thought I was. I've never fought at Greymarsh. I've never led men before this campaign. Everything you've heard about me is a lie." The silence was absolute. Cale recovered first. "Then, why?" "Because the king asked," Edric said simply. "And because, for all my lies, we've won every engagement so far. Not because of me, because of you." He gestured to the assembled soldiers. "Because you held the line at Red Fork. Because you charged when I did. Because you fought like demons at that damned watchtower." He let that sink in. Then, softer, "I may not be the commander you deserve, but I'm the one you've got. I'd rather lead men who question me than follow one who doesn't." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Cale unexpectedly laughed. "That's the first honest thing you've said, my lord." The tension broke like a storm cloud passing. Men chuckled. Shoulders relaxed. Edric bent to retrieve his sword, his hand steady for the first time in days. "We march in 5 minutes." As the men dispersed, Torvald sidled up beside him. "That," he said, "was either the bravest or the stupidest thing I've ever seen." Edric managed a weak smile. "Why not both?" The column moved out, their steps lighter than before. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd grown louder. But their tone had changed. Now they sounded almost like respect. Chapter 7. The Enemy's Mockery. 3 days after Edric's confession, the Valtieri learned of it. It started with arrows. Not the usual kind, loosed in volleys to kill, but single shots fired high into the air, carrying messages weighted with stones. The first landed near the supply carts with a thud, its parchment wrapped tightly around the shaft. A curious soldier unfurled it, squinted at the rough script, then brought it to Edric with a grimace. "Cool, the great lord of Lysarise." It read, "Atwe salute your honesty at last. Come to Black Hollow tomorrow, and we will teach you some new stories to tell your king, if you survive." Edric crumpled the note without comment. But by nightfall, copies seemed to be circulating through the entire camp. The men didn't laugh, exactly, but their eyes lingered on him with a new kind of wariness. The next morning, the taunts began in earnest. A Valtieri raiding party had positioned themselves just beyond bowshot, on a rocky outcropping overlooking the march. Their voices carried clearly in the crisp morning air. "Oh, Lord Embellishment," one called, his accent thick, but his diction precise. "Did the bridge at Greymarsh shrink in your memory? We heard it was 20 men, then 30. Now they say you've never seen battle at all." Another joined in, his tone dripping with mock concern. "Poor little noble. Did they give you a sword too heavy to lift? A horse too tall to mount?" Edric kept his face impassive, but his hands clenched on the reins. Beside him, Torvald muttered, "They're trying to bait you." "I know," Edric said through gritted teeth. It got worse. That afternoon, as the column wound through a narrow pass, they found the bodies. 3 dummies, dressed in rough approximations of noble finery, hung from a withered oak at the trail's edge. Each had a crudely painted sign around its neck. "Lord Liang, the Embellishment, Duke of Cowardzing." One of the younger soldiers made a strangled sound. Another spat. Edric forced himself to ride forward, to reach up and cut the nearest dummy down himself. The rope was rough under his fingers, the dummy's straw stuffing leaking from a gash in its belly. He turned to the watching men, his voice steady. "They fear us enough to waste time on this." It wasn't much, but it was something. The men nodded, their expressions hardening. The Valtieri, unfortunately, were just getting started. That night, their scouts reported movement in the surrounding hills. Not an attack, but something stranger. Pinpricks of light appeared along the ridges, resolving into a series of torches, arranged in unmistakable shapes, a laughing face, a crown tipping over, a stick figure fleeing. The distant sound of jeering echoed through the valley, punctuated by rhythmic chants of "Liar! Liar!" Edric sat by the command tent, listening to it all, a cup of wine forgotten in his hand. Torvald approached, his usual gruffness softened slightly. "They're children," he said. "All armies do this kind of nonsense before a real fight." "They're not wrong, though," Edric said quietly. Torvald snorted. "Neither are they original. I once saw a siege where the defenders catapulted rotten fruit carved to look like the opposing general's head. War makes fools of everyone eventually." Edric managed a thin smile. "I think I was ahead of the curve on that one." The next day brought the final insult. The army reached Black Hollow to find the Valtieri already arrayed on the opposite slope, but not in battle formation. Instead, they'd staged what could only be called a performance. A tall warrior in exaggerated noble garb, complete with an outsized codpiece, pranced along their front lines, waving a comically large sword. He pantomimed terror at the approach of a few bandits, actual Valtieri warriors holding branches to represent swords, then proceeded to slay them with increasingly absurd flourishes. Tripping over his own feet, accidentally hitting himself in the face with the flat of his blade, before finally defeating the last foe by apparently bribing him with an invisible perk. The entire Valtieri host roared with laughter. Edric's men stood in stony silence. Then, from somewhere in their ranks, a single voice called out, "Our lord may be a liar, but at least he's not that bad." A beat. Then laughter, real laughter, erupted from Edric's army. The sound seemed to startle the Valtieri, their mock play faltering. Edric, sightseeing the moment, urged his horse forward a few steps and doffed his helmet in an exaggerated bow toward the performer. "I yield to the master," he called. "Truly, your portrayal of noble cowardice is inspired." More laughter, louder now. The Valtieri's actor froze, uncertain how to respond to being mocked in return. Torvald moved up beside Edric, keeping his voice low. "That was actually not terrible. I've had practice," Edric murmured back. "Court taught me one useful skill, how to take a joke at my own expense." The moment passed, the tension broken. As both sides prepared for the real battle to come, something had shifted. The Valtieri's taunts had failed in their purpose, not because Edric's men no longer doubted him, but because they'd decided collectively that whatever their lord was, he was theirs to criticize, not some outsiders to mock. When the first real arrows flew that afternoon, it was almost a relief. The battle that followed was brutal, messy and inconclusive, like most battles, as Edric was learning. But when the Valtieri finally withdrew at dusk, leaving the field contested but not lost, something unexpected happened. As Edric moved among the wounded, a grizzled spearman grabbed his wrist. "My lord," he said, his voice tight with pain, but his grip firm. "You're shite at speeches, but you're all right at this." And for now, Edric realized, that was enough. Chapter 8. The Midnight Escape Plan. The camp was quiet, save for the occasional groan of a wounded man or the shuffle of sentries changing posts. Moonlight painted the tents in shades of silver and shadow. Inside his own tent, Edric sat hunched over a map he wasn't actually reading, his fingers drumming an uneven rhythm against the parchment. He had survived another battle. Mockery. The realization had been creeping up on him for days, tightening its grip with every near miss, every close call. He could not keep doing this. Luck had carried him this far, but luck was not a strategy. Sooner or later his incompetence would get someone killed, probably him, possibly everyone. He needed to leave. The thought was at once shameful and intoxicating. He could slip away tonight. Take a horse, ride hard for the border, lose himself in some distant province where no one had heard of Greymarsh or the Valtieri. He could grow a beard, change his name, become someone else entirely. A farmer, perhaps? Or a merchant? Someone whose biggest worry was bad harvests or unpaid debts, not leading men to their deaths. The plan formed with startling clarity. He would wait until the deepest watch of the night, when even the most alert sentries grew sluggish. He would take only what he could carry, some coin, a plain cloak, nothing that would mark him as noble. He would go south, toward the coast, where ships sailed daily for lands that had never heard of King Aldrich. It was possible. It was doable. It was, he realized with a sinking heart, completely impossible. Not because of the sentries, though they would certainly raise an alarm if they spotted him. Not because of the Valtieri, though their scouts prowled the countryside. No, the true obstacle was far more insidious: his own reputation. He had spun too many tales. In his years at court, he had claimed proficiency in a dozen languages, familiarity with every major trade route, personal friendships with merchants from a score of cities. If he tried to flee to the coast, what then? Would he pretend not to know the sailor's tongue he had once bragged of mastering? Would he feign ignorance of ports he had described in lavish detail? Worse still were the stories of his travels. He had regaled dinner parties with his adventures in the southern deserts, his narrow escapes from eastern bandits, his illicit romance with a spice merchant's daughter in the free cities. All lies, of course, but lies that had painted him as a man of the world, a man who would know exactly how to disappear. If he ran now, that reputation would follow him. A soft rustle at the tent flap made him start. Torvald ducked inside without waiting for an invitation, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Can't sleep?" Edric forced a chuckle. "Battle nerves, T." Torvald grunted, lowering himself onto a camp stool with the ease of a man who could sleep anywhere. "Funny thing, the men are saying you once spent a year among the mountain tribes learning their guerrilla tactics. That you're planning something clever for tomorrow." Edric's stomach twisted. That particular lie had been a crowd favorite. A thrilling tale of his capture by the savage hill folk and his subsequent escape, laden with stolen knowledge of their secret ways. "I've been thinking," Torvald continued, his voice carefully neutral, "that if anyone could find a way out of this mess, it'd be you." There it was, the trap of his own making. Edric stared at the map, the lines and symbols blurring before his eyes. He could confess now, admit that every scrap of his supposed expertise was fiction. But after days of holding the men together, of weathering their doubts and the Valtieri's mockery, what would that do to their morale? And if he didn't confess, if he tried to bluff his way through yet again, what then? Sooner or later his luck would run out. Torvald was watching him, waiting. Edric took a slow breath. "The mountain tribes," he began, then stopped. A memory surfaced, not one of his fabricated adventures, but a real moment from his childhood. His tutor, an old soldier, droning on about some long-ago campaign. He straightened. "The mountain tribes never attack at dawn." Torvald's eyebrow lifted. "They don't?" "No. They consider it bad luck." Edric seized on the half-remembered lesson, spinning it into something useful. "If we strike first thing, catch the Valtieri off guard. They'll be expecting that," Torvald pointed out. "After today's performance, they know we're spoiling for a fight." Edric nodded. "Exactly, so we don't give them one." He turned the map toward Torvald, his mind racing. "Look here. The valley narrows just past Black Hollow. If we pull back tonight, make it look like a retreat, they'll follow. And when they do—" Torvald's eyes gleamed in the candlelight. "Ambush." "Not an ambush," Edric corrected. Tactical realignment." The sergeant snorted. "Call it what you like, but it might just work." And just like that, the escape plan died. Not with a bang, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet, crushing realization that he was in far too deep to back out now. As Torvald left to rouse the sergeants, Edric remained seated, staring at the tent wall. Somewhere out there, a real commander might have been making real plans. Somewhere, A man who knew what he was doing might have been contemplating victory. Edric, meanwhile, contemplated survival. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another battle, another test, another chance to fail. He blew out the candle and lay back, listening to the distant sounds of the camp. Somewhere, a horse whickered. A sentry coughed. The world went on, indifferent to the schemes of noblemen and the fears of cowards. Dawn was coming, and with it the consequences of all his lies. Chapter 9. The battle dawns. The false retreat had worked better than Edric dared hope. As planned, the army had pulled back under cover of darkness, leaving behind abandoned campfires and a trail of discarded gear to sell the illusion of panicked flight. The Valtieri, predictably, had taken the bait. Now, as the first gray light of dawn crept over the valley, Edric stood at the mouth of the narrow pass where his men lay hidden, his palms slick with sweat inside his gauntlets. The gilded helmet he wore, a ridiculous thing meant more for show than protection, felt like a lead weight on his head. To his left, Torvald adjusted the strap of his shield with the calm of a man preparing for a morning stroll. "They're coming," he murmured. Edric didn't need to ask how he knew. The signs were everywhere if you knew to look. The crows lifting suddenly from a distant copse, the faint tremor in the earth beneath their feet, the way the morning mist swirled unnaturally where no wind blew. Somewhere down the line, a soldier retched. No one commented. Then, all at once, the Valtieri emerged from the gloom. They came cautiously at first, scouts flitting between rocks like shadows. Then, as they confirmed the retreat appeared genuine, the main force poured into the valley. A river of leather and steel, their horned helmets catching the pale light. Their laughter carried on the still air, cruel and confident. Edric's mouth went dry. His carefully rehearsed speech fled his mind. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there waiting for death to find him. Torvald elbowed him sharply in the ribs. "Now would be good, my lord." Edric swallowed hard, then raised his sword. The signal. A horn blast shattered the morning stillness. From the rocks above, a rain of arrows darkened the sky. From hidden gullies on either side, Edric's men surged forward with a roar that shook the earth. The Valtieri's confident advance turned to chaos in an instant. Horses rearing, men shouting. The narrow pass suddenly a death trap. Edric didn't remember moving, but suddenly he was running with the rest, his sword held high, his borrowed armor clanking with every step. The distance between himself and the enemy vanished in a blur. Then, with a crash that shuddered through his bones, the two forces met. The world narrowed to a nightmare of noise and motion. A Valtieri warrior lunged at him, teeth bared beneath his helmet. Edric parried clumsily, the impact jarring his arm to the shoulder. He retaliated with a wild swing that somehow connected, sending his opponent stumbling back. Someone jostled him from behind. He nearly fell, caught himself, and found himself face to face with another enemy. This one bigger, angrier, his axe already descending. Then Torvald was there, his shield deflecting the blow with a shower of sparks. "Stay on your feet," the sergeant barked before whirling back into the fray. Edric fought on, his movements mechanical, his mind oddly detached. This wasn't like the stories. There was no rhythm to it, no elegant dance of blade and counterblade. Just chaos and terror, and the desperate struggle to not die. A scream tore through the din. High, agonized, cut abruptly short. Edric didn't know if it came from friend or foe. He didn't want to know. Somehow, impossibly, the tide began to turn. The Valtieri, caught in the killing ground, faltered. Their formation splintered. A few tried to rally, but the press of bodies worked against them. Step by bloody step, they were driven back. Edric found himself atop a small rise, breathing like a bellows, his sword arm burning with fatigue. Below, the battle raged on, but the outcome seemed decided. They'd won. Actually, won. Then he saw it. At the edge of the fray, a knot of Valtieri warriors were retreating in good order, protecting something, no, someone, in their center. A tall figure in ornate armor, his helmet crowned with antlers. Their chieftain. Without thinking, Edric pointed. There. Torvald followed his gaze and grinned. Got him. The sergeant bellowed orders. A group of Edric's men broke off to pursue, but the Valtieri guards closed ranks, their spears forming a deadly hedge. For a moment, it seemed the chieftain might escape. Then an arrow found its mark. The chieftain staggered, clutching at his throat. His guards closed around him, but the damage was done. A great wail went up from the Valtieri ranks. Their advance collapsed into a rout, men streaming back the way they'd come, abandoning weapons, shields, even wounded comrades in their haste to flee. Silence fell, heavy and sudden. Edric stood amidst the carnage, his legs trembling beneath him. The air reeked of blood and bowels and sharp, acrid sweat. Around him, men cheered, but the sound seemed distant, muffled, as if heard through wool. Torvald appeared at his side, clapping him on the back hard enough to stagger him. We did it, you mad bastard. We actually did it. Edric tried to speak, but all that emerged was a hoarse croak. His vision swam. The gilded helmet, suddenly unbearable, felt like it was crushing his skull. With clumsy fingers he fumbled at the straps. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was the sky, bright, endless, and perfectly, mercifully empty. Chapter 10. The Unexpected Twist. Edric awoke to the smell of burning flesh and the sound of distant laughter. For one blissful moment, he thought he was back at court, dozing through some interminable banquet where the meat had been left too long on the spit. Then the pain hit, a throbbing ache in his skull that made his vision pulse with every heartbeat. He was lying in a tent, his armor removed, his body stiff beneath a rough wool blanket. Outside, the camp buzzed with an energy he hadn't heard before. Not the tense murmur of impending battle, nor the exhausted quiet after one, but something almost celebratory. The tent flap rustled. Torvald ducked inside, carrying a wooden bowl that steamed faintly in the cool air. Ah, you're alive. Good. The men were starting to place bets. Edric tried to sit up, groaned, and thought better of it. What happened? You fainted, Torvald said, setting the bowl within reach. Right after the battle, straight over like a felled tree. Very dramatic. He paused. Also very noble, apparently. The men are calling it the weight of command or some such nonsense. Edric blinked. They're not upset. Upset? Torvald barked a laugh. My lord, we just crushed the Valtieri's main force, killed their chieftain, sent the rest running back to their mountains with their tails between their legs. The men would carry you on their shoulders if you asked. Edric carefully propped himself up on one elbow and peered into the bowl. Some kind of stew, thick with chunks of meat and root vegetables. His stomach roiled. But how? Our plan was absolute horse shit. Torvald finished cheerfully, which is exactly why it worked. He dragged a stool closer and sat, his expression turning serious despite his tone. Turns out spending years spinning ridiculous battle stories gives you a unique advantage. No proper commander would have tried half the things you did. The Valtieri didn't know how to respond because none of it made tactical sense. Edric stared. Take that feigned retreat, Torvald continued. Any real officer knows you don't try that with green troops. They'll panic and turn it into a real rout. But the Valtieri didn't expect it for the same reason. Then there's your little speech before the charge. I was being sarcastic, Edric said weakly. Doesn't matter. The men believed it. More importantly, the enemy believed they believed it. Torvald shook his head. And that final mess at the pass? Pure madness. But by then the Valtieri were so convinced you were some kind of tactical genius that they assumed there had to be a trap. They hesitated, and hesitation loses battles. Edric lay back, his mind reeling. It made a terrible kind of sense. All his life, he'd treated war like a story, something to be embellished, dramatized, shaped for maximum effect. And now, by some cosmic joke, that very approach had won him a real victory. Outside, the laughter grew louder. Someone began singing, a body marching song Edric recognized from the capital, but with new verses added that seemed to feature his exploits prominent. Torvald stood. Rest up. The king's messengers should arrive by evening. I imagine His Majesty will want to hear all about your brilliant strategies firsthand. Edric closed his eyes. The king. Of course. Another audience, another performance. Only this time the stakes were higher than ever. Because now, against all odds, people actually believed the lie. And that, he realized with dawning horror, was far more dangerous than any battlefield. The bowl of stew sat untouched as he drifted back into uneasy sleep, lulled by the distant sounds of celebration and the creeping knowledge that he would have to do this all again. Only next time, they would expect him to win. Chapter 11. The Hollow Victory. The king's messenger arrived at dusk, his horse lathered from hard riding. Edric, still aching and unsteady, forced himself to stand straight as the man dismounted and presented the scroll with a flourish. The parchment bore the royal seal, thick and red as fresh blood. His Majesty sends his congratulations, the messenger announced loud enough for the gathered soldiers to hear, and commands your presence at court to receive honors for your glorious victory. A cheer went up from the men. Edric managed a smile that felt like a death rictus. When the messenger had been led away to food and rest, Torvald sidled close. You look like a man who just swallowed a live eel. Edric stared at the unopened scroll. This is a disaster. Torvald snorted. Most men would call a royal summons and public honors the opposite. Most men didn't blunder into victory through sheer dumb luck. Edric lowered his voice further. What happens when the king expects me to do it again? Or worse, asks me to explain how I did it? Torvald considered this. You could tell the truth. The laugh that escaped Edric's lips was sharp and humorless. Ah, yes. Forgive me, Your Majesty, but all my brilliant tactics were actually the military equivalent of throwing a chair out a window and hoping it hit someone important. I'm sure that will go over splendidly. He turned the scroll over in his hands. The wax seal caught the firelight, gleaming. All his life, he'd chased recognition, hungered for the spotlight. Now that it was his, he wanted nothing more than to crawl into a dark hole and never emerge. The celebration lasted long into the night. The men broke into their dwindling stores of ale, toasting Lord Edric the Unpredictable and the Mad Baron of Blackmore, with increasing volume and decreasing coherence. Someone had gotten hold of a Valtieri horned helmet and was passing it around as a drinking vessel. Laughter echoed off the surrounding hills. Edric sat apart watching. He should have been among them, basking in their admiration. Instead, he felt like an impostor standing atop a crumbling tower. Every cheer was another brick dislodged from his already shaky foundation. A young soldier, barely more than a boy, approached with 2 cups, his face flushed with drink and hero worship. My lord, he slurred, thrusting 1 cup at Edric. To your health? Edric took the cup. The ale inside smelled sour. What's your name? Roland, my lord. He hiccuped. Of Willowford. You fought well, Roland of Willowford. The words tasted like ash. The boy beamed as if knighted. We all did, my lord, just like you taught us. Edric forced himself to sip the ale. It was terrible. And what exactly did I teach you? To be bold, Roland declared, nearly spilling his drink with his enthusiasm. To trust our guts. He paused, brow furrowing in drunken concentration. To make the enemy think we're crazy, so they don't realize we're geniuses. Edric closed his eyes briefly. So that's how they were spinning it. Of course. When he opened them again, Roland was swaying dangerously. My lord, do you really think they'll make songs about us? The question hit like a dagger between the ribs. Edric looked past the boy to the revelry beyond. The singing, the laughter, the way the firelight painted everything in warm, golden tones, smoothing away the blood and dirt and terror of battle. This was what songs were made of. Not the messy reality, but the shining memory. Yes, he heard himself say. I expect they will. Roland whooped and stumbled back toward his comrades, nearly upending his ale in the process. Edric set his own cup down untouched. Torvald reappeared at his elbow. You realize you'll have to go, don't you? To court. Edric nodded slowly. And you'll have to keep doing this, leading, fighting, winning. Another nod. Torvald sighed. Well, on the bright side, you probably won't live long enough for it to become a problem. Edric couldn't help it. He laughed. It was either that or scream. The celebration raged on around them, oblivious. Somewhere in the crowd, someone began a new song, one that already had Edric's name in it. The words blurred together, the tune something borrowed from an old drinking ballad. Tomorrow, they would march for the capital. Tomorrow, he would don his gilded helmet and play the conquering hero. Tomorrow, the lie would grow another head. But tonight, for just a little longer, he sat in the firelight and let the song wash over him, wondering if this was how all great lies ended. Not with exposure, but with everyone choosing to believe anyway. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent. The night wore on, and Lord Edric of Blackmoor, hero of the realm, stared into his untouched ale, and saw nothing but his own reflection staring back. Chapter 12. The King's Reward. The royal court smelled of beeswax and ambition. Edric stood at the base of the dais, his boots still dusty from the road, acutely aware of every eye upon him. The throne room stretched impossibly large around them, its vaulted ceilings swallowing sound, its stained glass windows casting colored light across the marble floors, like spilled wine. King Aldrich leaned forward on his throne, his beard neatly trimmed, his crown catching the afternoon light. Lord Edric of Blackmoor, he intoned, his voice filling the cavernous space. Defender of the northern marches, vanquisher of the Valtieri. Each title landed like a stone in Edric's gut. He bowed deeply, buying time to school his expression. When he straightened, he found the king studying him with unsettling intensity. We have heard remarkable tales of your campaign, the king continued. A feigned retreat executed with such precision it fooled even our own marshals. A decisive strike at the enemy's heart. A victory against impossible odds. Edric's mouth went dry. The official reports had clearly been embellished somewhere between the battlefield and the capital. Your Majesty is too kind. I merely... Nonsense. The king waved a jeweled hand. Modesty ill becomes a warrior of your accomplishments. He gestured to a servant, who stepped forward bearing a velvet cushion. Upon it rested a sword. Not some ceremonial bauble, but a serious weapon, its pommel worked with silver, its blade catching the light with a dangerous gleam. From our own armory, the king said, for the man who has given us back our northern borders. The court erupted in polite applause. Edric took the sword, its weight unfamiliar in his hands. The balance was perfect, the edge sharp enough to split hairs. A weapon for someone who actually knew how to use it. And there is more, the king said, silencing the room with a look. Our cousin Duke Orsino has petitioned for aid against the mountain clans. We can think of none better to lead this expedition than the hero of Black Hollow. Edric's grip tightened on the sword. The mountain clans made the Valtieri look like rowdy school children. They lived in impregnable stone keeps, knew every goat path through the crags, and had a well-documented habit of throwing prisoners off cliffs. "I am unworthy of such an honor," he managed. The king smiled, revealing teeth that looked altogether too sharp. "Come now. After your performance against the Valtieri, we insist." It was not a request. Edric bowed again, lower this time, both to hide his expression and to buy himself a moment to think. When he rose, he had arranged his features into what he hoped looked like humble acceptance rather than abject terror. The audience concluded with the usual formalities. Edric knelt. The king said pretty words. The courtiers murmured approvingly. Through it all, the new sword hung heavy at Edric's hip, its presence somehow more damning than any accusation. Afterward, in the relative privacy of an antechamber, Torvald let out a low whistle. "Well, that could have gone worse." Edric stared at him. "How, precisely?" "You're not in chains, not being marched to the dungeons for deception." Torvald shrugged. "Seems like a win to me." Edric groaned and slumped onto a stone bench. "The mountain clans, Torvald. The mountain clans. I've heard they're lovely this time of year. If you enjoy rocks and death." A servant entered with wine. Edric drained his cup in one go, barely tasting it. The sword bumped against his leg, a constant reminder of the hole he dug himself into. Across the room, a group of young nobles had gathered, eyeing Edric with open admiration. One, a gangly youth with unfortunate facial hair, broke away and approached with the tentative steps of a man meeting his idol. "My lord," he said, executing a bow so deep he nearly toppled over. "Your tactics at Black Hollow, they're being taught already at the military academy. They're calling it the Blackmore feint." Edric blinked. "They're what?" "Your use of terrain, your exploitation of enemy expectations." The youth's eyes shone with fervor. "They say you study it under the great mercenary captains of the free cities." Edric opened his mouth, closed it. The lie had taken on a life of its own, spawning new falsehoods like some grotesque hydra. Torvald rescued him. "His lordship is weary from travel. Perhaps another time." The youth backed away, bowing repeatedly. "Of course. Forgive me. When you're rested, perhaps you might visit the academy? The cadets would be honored beyond measure." When he'd gone, Edric put his head in his hands. "This is a nightmare." Torvald refilled his cup. "Could be worse." "How?" "You could be facing the mountain clans without royal favor, or a very nice sword." Edric eyed the weapon where it rested against the bench. It really was beautifully made, the sort of blade a true warrior might treasure. He took another drink. The wine was excellent, rich and dark. Somewhere in the palace, musicians had begun playing. The sound drifted through the corridors, light and carefree. Outside, the sun shone on a kingdom at peace, a kingdom that believed in him. Edric sighed and reached for the wine again. Tomorrow he would have to start planning another campaign. Tomorrow he would have to become a general in truth. But tonight, just for tonight, he would drink, and try very hard not to think about cliffs. Chapter 13. The next campaign. The road to Duke Orsino's lands wound through increasingly rugged terrain, each mile taking them further from civilization, and deeper into the kind of landscape that seemed designed to kill interlopers. Jagged peaks loomed in the distance, their tops lost in cloud. The trees grew stunted and twisted, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. Even the birds sounded different here, harsher, mocking. Edric rode at the head of the column, the king's gift sword hanging conspicuously at his side. Every jolt of his horse sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. Behind him marched 500 men, seasoned veterans from the Valtieri campaign, mixed with fresh recruits eager for glory. They sang as they walked, their voices echoing off the canyon walls. The song was new, something the bards had composed about his victory at Black Hollow. He'd heard it at least a dozen times since leaving the capital, and each verse made him want to leap from his saddle and flee into the wilderness. Torvald, ever observant, guided his horse closer. "You look green." "I feel green," Edric muttered. "It's not too late to fake your death." Edric shot him a look. The sergeant was joking, probably, but the idea had merit. A simple accident, a fall from a cliff, perhaps. Quick. Clean. Certainly preferable to whatever the mountain clans did to captured officers. He'd heard stories about pits full of sharpened stakes, about being staked out over anthills. My lord! A scout came galloping back down the trail, his face flushed. "Duke Orsino's outriders have spotted us. They're coming to escort us the rest of the way." Edric straightened in the saddle, forcing his expression into something resembling command. "Good. How far to the castle?" "Half a day's march. Less if we push the pace." Edric nodded, suddenly aware of how dry his mouth was. Half a day until he had to face Orsino. Half a day until this farce entered its next act. The Duke's men arrived in a clatter of hooves and polished steel. Their leader, a grizzled knight with a nose that had been broken more than once, bowed stiffly from his saddle. "Lord Blackmore, the Duke awaits your counsel with great anticipation." The emphasis on counsel made Edric's palms sweat. Orsino had been at court when Edric's reputation was built on wine-soaked boasts. The Duke knew exactly what he was. The castle appeared as they rounded a bend in the valley, a hulking monstrosity of black stone perched on a cliff like a vulture eyeing carrion. Its towers leaned at odd angles, its walls scarred from countless sieges. Smoke rose from within, but the banners hanging limp in the still air bore Orsino's colors, a red boar on a field of black. Edric's stomach twisted. He'd been here before, years ago, when his greatest concern had been whether the Duke's famously sour wine would stain his doublet. He'd told stories at that feast, hadn't he? Something about single-handedly putting down a peasant revolt. Or had it been the time he'd claimed to have bested 3 knights in a melee? The details blurred, but the sinking feeling in his gut remained. The portcullis rose with a groan of ancient chains. The courtyard beyond stank of manure and iron. Duke Orsino waited atop the keep steps, his bulk swathed in furs despite the mild weather, his small eyes glittering with something between amusement and malice. "Lord Edric," he called, as Edric dismounted. Or should I say, the hero of Black Hollow? The title sounded like an insult coming from those thick lips. Edric bowed. "Your Grace, the king sends his greetings." "And his problem," Orsino interrupted. He jerked his head toward the keep. "Come, we'll talk inside. Your men will be seen to." The Duke's war room was exactly as Edric remembered. Low ceilinged, smoky, and lined with maps that smelled faintly of mildew. A massive table dominated the center, its surface carved with crude depictions of battles past. Orsino dropped into a chair that creaked alarmingly under his weight and gestured for Edric to sit opposite. "You'll forgive me if I skip the pleasantries," the Duke said without preamble. "The mountain clans have raided 3 of my villages this month alone. They're getting bolder." He shoved a cup of wine across the table. "The king seems to think you're the solution to this problem." Edric took the cup but didn't drink. "Your Grace, Spare me." Orsino leaned forward, his breath reeking of garlic and old meat. "I was there when you claimed to have fought off 20 bandits with nothing but a dinner knife. I heard the Greymarsh story the first time you told it, back when it was only 10 men and a particularly aggressive squirrel." Edric's fingers tightened around the cup. "So here's what's going to happen," the Duke continued. "You'll take your men into the mountains. You'll make some appropriately heroic gestures, and when you fail, because you will, I'll sweep in with my own forces and finish the job." He smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "The king gets his victory. I get my land secured. And you, well, You'll probably be dead, but at least you'll die a hero. The wine tasted like vinegar. Edric set it down carefully. And if I succeed? Orsino laughed, a deep, unpleasant sound. Then I'll eat my own boots, with mustard. Outside, a bell began to toll. Somewhere in the castle, a dog barked. The maps on the walls seemed to leer at Edric, their inked lines twisting like snares. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against stone. With your permission, I should see to my men. The Duke waved a meaty hand. By all means, you march at dawn. The words hung in the air between them, heavy as an executioner's axe. Edric turned and left, his boots echoing in the narrow corridor. Torvald fell into step beside him as he emerged into the courtyard. Well, we march at dawn, Edric said dully. Torvald took one look at his face and sighed. That bad? Worse, Edric thought but didn't say. Far worse. Above them, the castle's banners fluttered in a sudden gust. The red boar seemed to grin down at him, its embroidered tusks catching the light like knives. Dawn was coming. And with it, the beginning of the end. Chapter 14. The Advisor's Scheme. Duke Orsino's advisor found Edric at dusk, perched on a crumbling section of battlement, overlooking the training yard below. The man moved with unsettling silence for someone so richly dressed. His velvet slippers whispering across the stone, his jeweled rings catching the fading light like tiny watchful eyes. Lord Blackmore, he murmured, bowing just deeply enough to be polite without conceding actual respect. Might I have a word? Edric recognized him from court. Lord Vexley, the Duke's so-called Shadow Chancellor, a man whose reputation for cunning was matched only by his skill at surviving regime changes. Of course, Edric said, bracing himself. Vexley leaned against the parapet, his gaze fixed on the soldiers drilling below. His Grace can be blunt, he began, delicately. But he values results above all else. A pause. As do I. The implication hung between them like a spider on its thread. Edric kept his expression neutral. I serve at the king's pleasure. And at his Grace's discretion, Vexley countered smoothly. Tell me, how familiar are you with the Black Fang Pass? Edric's pulse quickened. The pass was the only viable route into the heart of Mountain Clan territory. A narrow defile flanked by sheer cliffs famously treacherous. Sufficiently. Vexley's smile didn't reach his eyes. How fortunate, because His Grace believes, and I concur, that a bold strike there could end this conflict before winter. Below, a recruit misjudged a parry and earned a wooden sword to the ribs. The crack echoed off the stone walls. It's a death trap, Edric said before he could stop himself. All the better to surprise them, Vexley purred. After all, no sane commander would attempt it, which, if the rumors are true, makes it perfect for you. Edric turned to face him fully. The advisor's expression was all polite interest, but something cold lurked behind his gaze. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a test. I'll consider it, Edric said carefully. Vexley inclined his head. Do. His Grace plans to discuss strategy after supper. I'm sure he'll be fascinated to hear your thoughts. With that, he withdrew as silently as he'd come, leaving behind only the faint scent of peppermint and something faintly chemical. Torvald found Edric still staring at the empty space where Vexley had stood. That looked unpleasant. Edric rubbed his temples. He wants us to take Black Fang Pass. Torvald went very still. That's not a strategy. That's a massacre waiting to happen. I know. They'll roll boulders down on us, shoot us like fish in a barrel. I know. Torvald spat over the battlement. He's on to you. Edric didn't answer. The truth was obvious. Vexley suspected his incompetence and was maneuvering him into a position where it would be fatal. The question was, did Orsino know? Or was this the advisor playing his own game? Supper was a tense affair. The Duke held court at the high table, gnawing on a haunch of meat with single-minded intensity, while his captains debated troop placements. Vexley sat at his right hand, sipping wine and watching Edric like a cat at a mouse hole. When the moment came, Edric spoke before he could be cornered. "Your Grace, I propose we send scouts to Blackfang at once." Orsino paused mid-bite. "Oh?" "To study the terrain," Edric continued, improvising wildly. "The clans will expect us to come through the main valley. Blackfang is the last route they'd anticipate, which is precisely why we should feign interest in it." Vexley's eyebrow twitched. Orsino grunted. "You want to trick them into reinforcing it, while we strike elsewhere?" "Yes." Edric took a calculated risk. "Perhaps the Silver Run Gorge?" The table erupted. Silver Run was nearly as bad as Blackfang, a steep, rocky defile where a handful of defenders could hold off an army. Vexley's smile turned razor-thin. "An intriguing notion, Lord Blackmore. But wouldn't that leave your flank exposed when—" "Exactly," Edric cut in. "Gambling everything. Which is why we'll need Duke Orsino's reserves positioned here." He stabbed at the map with a knife, choosing a spot at random. A hush fell. Orsino studied the map, then Edric, then the map again. Slowly he began to chuckle. "Clever bastard. You're trying to get my troops committed before the real fighting starts." Edric held his breath. The Duke turned to Vexley. "See? This is why I keep telling you. Madness and genius are cousins." He slammed his tankard down, spraying ale across the table. "We'll do it your way, Blackmore. But if this goes tits up, it's your head on the spike." Later, in the cramped quarters he'd been assigned, Edric sank onto his cot and put his head in his hands. Torvald leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "That," the sergeant said, "was either brilliant or the worst thing you've ever done." Edric groaned. "Both can be true." Outside, the castle dogs began howling at some unseen moon. The sound raised the hairs on Edric's neck, a primal warning of dangers unseen. Vexley knew. Of that much he was certain. And now the game had changed. Survival was no longer just about facing the mountain clans. It was about outmaneuvering a man who made his living destroying rivals. Somewhere in the darkness a shutter banged in the wind, over and over, like a hammer on a nail, or a headsman testing his blade. Chapter 15. The Breaking Point. The army marched at first light, a column of men and horses winding up into the foothills like ants climbing a table leg. Edric rode at the front, his back stiff under the weight of his armor and the stares of his men. The plan, if it could be called that, was madness. A feint toward Blackfang Pass while the real strike came through Silver Run Gorge, all hinging on Duke Orsino's reserves arriving in time to prevent annihilation. It wouldn't work. Edric knew this with the same certainty he knew the sun would set. The mountain clans weren't the Valtieri. They wouldn't be fooled by theatrics. They knew this land like their own scars. And Vexley's eyes had glittered with quiet triumph when the orders were given, as if he'd already written the report detailing Edric's failure. By midday the terrain turned cruel. The path narrowed to a rocky track barely wide enough for two horses abreast. A bitter wind scoured the exposed slopes, carrying the scent of pine and something darker, charcoal, perhaps, or distant smoke. Torvald guided his mount closer. "Scouts report movement ahead. Could be shepherds, could be clan lookouts." Edric nodded absently. His fingers ached from gripping the reins too tight. Every decision he'd made since leaving the capital had been wrong. Every step had taken him deeper into the trap. The weight of it pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. They made camp that night in a shallow depression that offered little shelter but decent visibility. The men went about their routines with quiet efficiency, but Edric caught the glances they cast his way, less trusting now, more questioning. They'd followed him into the unknown once, and survived. Doing it again required faith he wasn't sure he deserved. A light rain began to fall as dusk settled. Edric stood at the edge of camp, watching the water slide down his gauntlets, when movement caught his eye. A figure approached through the mist. Not one of his men, but a girl no more than 12, her bare feet soundless on the wet stone. Before he could react, she was there, pressing something into his hand, a scrap of folded leather, then vanishing back into the gloom as swiftly as she'd come. Edric unfolded the leather with trembling fingers. Inside lay a single arrowhead, its edges razor-sharp, its surface stained dark, and wrapped around it, a lock of hair tied with a red thread. His breath caught. He knew that color, the same bright auburn as his sister's. The message was clear. The clans had been to Blackmoor, and they would go again. Something inside him snapped. When Torval found him moments later, Edric was already barking orders to break camp. "We're changing course," he said, his voice raw. "Forget Blackfang. Forget Silver Run. We march straight for the heart." Torval stared. "That's suicide." "Exactly." Edric's laugh was jagged at the edges. "They'll never expect it." "But the plan was a trap. Vexley's been playing us from the start." The words tumbled out in a torrent, all the lies and half-truths he'd carried for months, finally breaking free. "I'm not a hero. I'm not a strategist. Every victory I've had was luck or someone else's doing. But these men," he gestured to the soldiers already moving at his command, "they're real. Their lives are real, and I'll be damned if I lead them into an ambush for some nobleman's gain." Torval studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he grinned. "About time you said it." "What? You think we didn't know?" Torval shook his head. "The men have been following you, not your reputation. Might want to remember that." Edric opened his mouth, closed it. The rain fell harder now, dripping from his helmet, mingling with something warmer on his cheeks. Orders were given. The column turned, not toward the passes where death waited, but up the steepest, most impossible route, the one no sane army would attempt, the one even the clans left unguarded. As they climbed into the storm, Edric realized with startling clarity that for the first time since this began, he wasn't afraid. The truth, it turned out, made a better shield than any lie. And if they died tomorrow, at least they'd do it on their own terms. The rocks beneath their feet were slick, the path treacherous. But for the first time in a long while, Edric's footing felt sure. Chapter 16. The Enemy's Bargain. The mountain clans found them at dawn. Edric's scraggly force had barely crested the ridge when the horns sounded. Not the deep bellowing calls of the Valtieri, but high wailing shrieks that set the teeth on edge. Figures appeared along the surrounding cliffs, silhouetted against the morning sun, their fur-lined armor making them look more beast than man. Torval cursed softly. They knew we were coming. Of course they had. Edric's gambit had been bold, but not bold enough to overcome generations of mountain-born cunning. Now his exhausted men stood exposed on the rocky slope, their backs to a sheer drop, their path forward blocked by a wall of clan warriors. A single rider broke from the enemy lines, picking his way down the slope with casual grace. He wore no helmet, his long dark hair threaded with silver and bones, his face lined with scars that spoke of a lifetime of violence. The legendary clan chief, Dragon the Untamed, in the flesh. Edric stepped forward before Torval could stop him. Dragon Rhynit in just out of sword reach, his shaggy mountain pony snorting clouds in the cold air. Up close, his eyes were startlingly blue, his grin revealing a missing front tooth. "So," he said in heavily accented but perfectly intelligible common tongue, "you are the famous Lord Liar." Edric's hand twitched toward his sword. "I prefer Lord Blackmoor." Dragon laughed, a rough, barking sound. "Oh, we know all about you. The man who talks his way into battles then forgets how to fight them." He leaned forward in the saddle. "Tell me, How does it feel to be Duke Orsino's sacrificial goat? The words hit like a slap. Edric kept his face still through sheer force of will. If you're going to kill us, get on with it. Kill you? Dragon made a show of looking around at the exhausted, outnumbered soldiers. Where would be the sport in that? His expression turned sly. Besides, I think you and I might help each other. Edric blinked. What? Dragon dismounted with easy grace and stepped closer, lowering his voice. Orsino wants you dead. My scouts intercepted his messages. He plans to have his reserves arrive too late to save you. The clan chief's breath smelled of garlic and fermented goat milk. But what if I let you live? Let you march back to his castle with some of my men as your prisoners. Edric's pulse roared in his ears. You want me to betray the Duke? I want you to survive, Dragon corrected. And in return, you give me Orsino's head on a pike. He grinned again. A fair trade, yes? The wind howled across the rocks, carrying with it the faint jingle of harness and the nervous shifting of men who knew death was near. Somewhere far below, an eagle cried. Edric looked past Dragon to his own men, filthy, exhausted, watching him with wary hope. He thought of the lock of his sister's hair, of Vexley's smug smile, of the king's sword hanging heavy at his hip, a symbol of everything he wasn't. He reached for the blade now, drawing it slowly. Dragon's warriors tensed, but the chief himself didn't move, his grin never wavering. Edric turned the sword in his hands, studying the fine craftsmanship, the razor edge. Then, with deliberate care, he drove it point first into the rocky ground between them. I'll make you a better offer, he said. Dragon's eyebrow rose. Oh, take me as your prisoner instead. Silence fell over the mountainside. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Torvald made a strangled noise. My lord. Edric kept his eyes locked on Dragon's. March me into Orsino's hall in chains. Let him think his plan worked. Then, he shrugged. Well, you're the expert at killing dukes. Dragon threw back his head and laughed, the sound echoing off the cliffs. Oh, I like you, Lord Liar. He clapped Edric on the shoulder hard enough to stagger him. We'll make a clansman of you yet. And just like that, the path forward became clear. Not as a hero, not as a fraud, but as something else entirely. Something far more dangerous. Edric glanced back at his men, at their bewildered faces, and offered them the only thing he had left, the truth. Trust me, he said. Just one more time. Torvald sighed. Gods help us all. But when Dragon's warriors moved in to bind their hands, not a single soldier resisted. The sun climbed higher, painting the snow-capped peaks in gold. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled. And Edric of Blackmoor, hero of the realm, walked willingly into captivity, and toward the reckoning that had been coming for him since the very first lie. Chapter 17. The Betrayal. The chains chafed. Edric shifted his wrists, trying to ease the bite of cold iron against raw skin, but there was no comfort to be found. Dragon's warriors had bound him with all the ceremony due a prized captive, his hands locked before him, his ankles linked by a length of chain just short enough to make walking a torment. The mountain clans knew their business. They marched in a loose column down the rocky trail, Edric stumbling at the center of a ring of warriors, his own men following behind under wary guard. The story was simple. Lord Blackmoor had led his forces into a trap and been captured, his surviving soldiers spared through the mercy of the great chief Dragon. A fine tale. Believable enough to fool Orsino, especially when paired with the bruises and cuts Edric had insisted they add for authenticity. What he hadn't accounted for was his own men. At first he noticed only the silence. No muttered curses, no clank of armor, just an eerie quiet as they picked their way down the mountain. Then came the glances, not the fearful looks of prisoners, but something darker, sharper. The way a pack eyes a wounded member. Torvald was nowhere to be seen. Edric slowed his steps, letting the gap between himself and his guards widen. A young soldier, one of the fresh recruits from the capital, edged closer. His name was Jareth. Edric remembered. A blacksmith's son with quick hands and a quicker smile. There was no smile now. "My lord," Jareth murmured, so low the words barely carried. "You should know." A clansman's boot connected with the boy's ribs, sending him sprawling. "No talking." Edric started forward, chains rattling. "He's just a boy." The warrior grinned, showing filed teeth. Then he should learn silence. Jareth scrambled up, his face pale with pain, but his eyes burning with something Edric couldn't name. Not fear. Not anger. Something worse. Understanding dawned like a sickness. They thought this was real. Of course they did. Why wouldn't they? He'd spent months proving himself a liar, a fraud, a man who would say anything to save his own skin. Why would they believe this sudden turn to honesty? The column pressed on, the trail widening as it descended toward the valley where Orsino's castle waited. The air grew thicker here, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Somewhere ahead, water rushed over stone, the silver run that gave the gorge its name. A hand caught Edric's elbow, steadying him as he navigated a steep section. He turned, expecting another clansman, and found himself face to face with Torvald. The sergeant's grip was iron. "We need to talk." Edric opened his mouth, but Torvald's fingers dug in warningly. "Not here." They reached the river as dusk painted the sky in shades of blood and ash. Dragon called a halt, ordering camp made on a flat stretch of shore. The warriors tethered their prisoners in a rough circle around the fire, close enough for warmth but not conversation. Edric waited until the guards' attention turned to their meal before twisting to catch Torvald's eye. The sergeant sat just beyond reach, his face a mask of shadow and flickering firelight. "They think you've betrayed them," Torvald said, without preamble. Edric's gut clenched. "I know. Jareth and the others are planning something stupid." "How stupid?" "Tomorrow, when we near the castle, I mean to rush the guards. Die fighting rather than be marched into Orsino's dungeons." Torvald's voice was flat. "They think you arranged this." Edric closed his eyes. The river's rush filled the silence between them. Somewhere in the dark, an owl called. "Tell me you have a plan," Torvald said at last. Edric looked at his men, really looked at them. The way Jareth rubbed at his wrists where the ropes had bitten in. The way old Harold stared into the flames like a man already dead. The way the youngest ones huddled together, their shoulders shaking with silent tears. These were the men who had followed him. Not the king, not the dukes. And he had failed them. "I do," Edric lied. Torvald studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Good." But when the sergeant turned away, Edric saw the truth in the set of his shoulders. Torvald knew. And tomorrow, when the time came, he would stand with the others. Against Edric. The fire burned low. One by one the clansmen drifted off to sleep, leaving only a pair of sentries to watch the prisoners. Edric lay back on the hard ground, the chains cold against his chest, and stared up at the stars. Somewhere out there his sister waited. Somewhere Orsino and Vexley plotted. Somewhere the king toasted the victory that would never come. And here, in this makeshift camp by a nameless river, the last threads of his deception unraveled. The owl called again, lonely and mournful. Edric closed his eyes and prayed for dawn. Chapter 18. The Final Stand. Dawn came, as it always did, indifferent to the affairs of men. The camp stirred to life with a reluctant sluggishness of those marching toward doom. Edric watched his men through bloodshot eyes as they were prodded to their feet, their faces set in grim masks. Jareth wouldn't meet his gaze. Torvald stood apart, his expression unreadable. Dragon swaggered over, tossing a crust of hard bread into Edric's lap. "Last meal, Lord Liar," he chuckled. "By dusk, you'll be back in Orsino's tender care." Edric forced a dry swallow of the bread, the taste like ashes in his mouth. Every possible outcome of the day ahead ended in blood. If his men rebelled, they would die. If they didn't, Dragon's plan would unfold, and Edric would be exposed as either a traitor or a fool. And city, there was one other option. He waited until the column was on the move before stumbling deliberately, going down hard on the rocky trail. The chains clanked as he rolled onto his back, gasping. Dragon's boot connected with his ribs. "Oh, can't," Edric wheezed, clutching his side. "Ankle's broken." The chieftain crouched, gripping Edric's chin. "You're as bad at faking injury as you are at war." Edric held his stare. 10, it shouldn't trouble you to check." A beat passed. Then Dragon barked an order, and 2 warriors hauled Edric to his feet, unlatching the ankle chains for inspection. It was all the opening he needed. Edric drove his knee into the first warrior's groin, snatched the dagger from his belt, and slashed at the second. The blade found flesh, a shallow cut across the forearm, but enough to startle the man into loosening his grip. Chaos erupted. Edric lunged for Dragon, but the chieftain was quicker, twisting aside with the warrior's reflexes. The dagger scored across his cheek, drawing a thin line of crimson, but the counterblow sent Edric sprawling into the dirt, his vision swimming. "Kill him?" Dragon roared, pressing a hand to his bleeding face. Edric rolled onto his back, the dagger still clutched in his fist, not to fight, but to press the point to his own throat. "No," he panted. "You won't." The warriors hesitated. Dragon's eyes narrowed. "You need me alive," Edric continued, the blade trembling against his skin. "Orsino won't open his gates for just my corpse." A tense silence fell. Somewhere behind him, Edric heard the shift of bodies, his men stirring. Then Torvald's voice cut through the stillness. "He's right." Edric turned his head just enough to see the sergeant step forward, his hands free, his expression hard. "But you don't need all of us." Dragon wiped blood from his cheek, considering. "What are you proposing?" Torvald didn't look at Edric. "Let the men go. Just take him." For a heartbeat, Edric thought his own men might protest. But the silence held. No one moved to defend him. Dragon laughed, low and ugly. "Though the great Lord Blackmore dies alone, after all." He gestured to his warriors. "Cut the others loose." The ropes fell away. The soldiers shuffled back, their faces a mix of relief and shame. Only Jareth hesitated, his hands half raised as if to intervene, but a sharp look from Torvald stilled him. Edric let the dagger drop. He had gambled everything on this moment, not on escape, not on victory, but on ensuring his men walked away alive. As the clansman bound his wrists anew, he caught Torvald's eye one last time. The sergeant gave the barest nod, not of forgiveness, but understanding. Then the warriors hauled Edric to his feet, and the march resumed, quieter now. The castle appeared at midday, its dark walls looming over the valley. Orsino's banners flapped in the wind, the red boar seeming to leer down at them. Edric straightened his shoulders. He had no more lies left, no more tricks, only the truth, and whatever scraps of honor remained. The portcullis creaked open, and Lord Edric of Blackmore, the liar, the fraud, the accidental hero, walked forward to meet his fate. Chapter 19. The Aftermath. The dungeon smelled of damp stone and old misery. Edric sat with his back against the wall, his shackled wrists resting on his knees, counting the slow drip of water from the ceiling. 3 days had passed since Dragon's warriors had thrown him into Orsino's cells. 3 days of silence, of stale bread and tepid water, of waiting for the axe to fall. The door at the top of the stairs creaked open. Torchlight flickered against the walls, casting monstrous shadows. Boots echoed on stone. Too many for a simple executioner. Duke Orsino appeared between two guards, his bulk draped in fur-trimmed velvet, his fingers glittering with rings. Bexley hovered at his shoulder like a carrion bird. "Well," the Duke rumbled, "this is disappointing." Edric didn't bother standing. "My apologies for failing to die on schedule." Orsino's laugh shook dust from the ceiling. "Oh, I like you, Blackmore. Pity you're so damnably inconvenient." He gestured, and a guard unlocked the cell. "Get up. The king wants you." Edric's chains fell away. His legs nearly buckled as he stood, muscles stiff from days of inactivity. "The king?" "Apparently," Orsino said, lip-curling. "Your little stunt impressed him? The heroic last stand to save your men. The daring sacrifice." He leaned in close, his breath sour with wine. "Personally, I think you're just lucky the mountain clans decided to sue for peace the moment Dragon got himself killed." Edric blinked. "Dragon's dead?" Bexley's smile was knife-thin. "An unfortunate hunting accident, right after returning from his triumphant campaign." The pieces fell into place with cold clarity. Orsino had never intended to let the clan chief live long enough to betray him. The Duke clapped Edric on the back hard enough to stagger him. "Come along, His Majesty awaits." The throne room was brighter than Edric remembered, the sunlight through the high windows, nearly blinding after the dungeon's gloom. The courtiers parted as Orsino's guards marched him forward, their whispers following like a trailing cloak. King Aldrich sat atop the dais, his crown gleaming, his face unreadable. At his side stood Torval, alive, unharmed, his sergeant's insignia replaced with an officer's gorget. Edric went to one knee, the stone cold beneath him. "Lord Blackmore," the king said. "Risa kunt isin. He did. His mouth was dry as parchment. Aldrich studied him for a long moment. Then, abruptly, he laughed. "By all rights, I should have your head. You lied to your king. You falsified battle reports. You bungled a campaign so thoroughly it's a miracle anyone survived." Edric said nothing. "And yet," the king continued, "you somehow turned complete disaster into victory. The mountain clans have sued for peace. Duke Orsino's borders are secure. And your men," he gestured to Tor, "your men would apparently march into the 9 hells at your command." Torval's face gave nothing away. Aldrich leaned forward. "So here is my judgment. You will retain your lands and title. You will keep the sword I gave you. And you will take command of the new border garrison, under Marshal Torval's supervision, of course." Edric nearly choked. "Marshal?" Torval's eyebrow twitched. Evidently, this was news to him as well. The king waved a hand. "Promotions all around. The bards are already writing songs about your heroic last stand. It would be a shame to waste good propaganda." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just remember, Lord Blackmore, this is your last chance. Next time the dungeon will be the least of your worries." The dismissal was clear. Edric bowed, backed away, and nearly collided with a servant bearing wine. Outside, the sunlight was painfully bright. The castle courtyard bustled with activity. Soldiers drilling, merchants hawking wares, children chasing a stray dog. Normal life continuing as if nothing had changed. Torval appeared at his elbow. "You look like a man who's just been told his hanging's been postponed." Edric shook his head slowly. "I don't understand." "You saved your men," Torval said simply. "Turns out that counts for something." He handed Edric a wineskin. "Even if you are the worst liar I've ever met." The wine was surprisingly good, rich and spiced, nothing like the swill they'd shared on campaign. Somewhere in the city, a minstrel had already begun singing about the Battle of Black Hollow, the words drifting on the breeze. Edric took another long drink. The past months unspooled in his mind, The lies, the blunders, the desperate gambles that somehow, impossibly, hadn't gotten them all killed. He'd set out to be a hero and ended up something else entirely. Torvald clapped him on the shoulder. "Come on, the men are waiting." And Lord Edric of Blackmore, fraud and accidental hero, straightened his borrowed tunic and followed his marshal into the sun. Chapter 20. The legend lives on. The tavern was warm, the ale passable, and the company surprisingly tolerable for a roadside inn in the middle of nowhere. Edric, Nove Grey, at the temples and sporting a knee that ached before rain, sat in a shadowed corner, listening to the minstrel tune his lute. "Tonight, good folk, a tale most true," the minstrel declared, plucking a dramatic chord. "The legend of Lord Blackmore and the siege of Black Hollow." Edric choked on his drink. The patrons cheered, banging their tankards on the rough wooden tables. A child near the front clapped with delight. The mighty lord stood alone against 1,000 savage clansmen. The minstrel sang, his voice rising. His sword flashed like lightning. His armor shone like the sun. Edric groaned into his ale. Next to him Torval, now properly Marshal Torval, though he still drank like a foot soldier, snorted. The clansmen quaked in fear. The minstrel continued, for they knew they faced the greatest warrior of the age. A serving girl paused by their table, her eyes bright. "Isn't it wonderful, my lord, to hear such bravery celebrated?" Edric opened his mouth. Torvald kicked him under the table. "I suppose," Edric muttered instead. The song spiraled into ever greater absurdity. Edric single-handedly scaling cliffs, wrestling mountain lions, out-drinking the entire clan council. By the time the minstrel reached the part where he'd supposedly defeated Dragon in a duel while blindfolded, even the most credulous farmers were exchanging skeptical looks. Yet no one protested. No one stood to say it hadn't happened that way. The tale was too good, too satisfying, the kind of story people wanted to believe. Torvald signaled for another round. "You know, I think I prefer the songs to the truth." Edric rubbed his knee absently. The old wound from the Valtieri campaign still twinged on cold nights. "At least the songs have better endings." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. The fire in the hearth danced, casting flickering shadows across the rapt faces of the listeners. The minstrel's voice rose in a final, triumphant verse, one where Edric, of course, married a beautiful princess and ruled wisely for 100 years. Torvald raised his tankard. "To the legend." Edric clinked his own against it, the ale sloshing slightly. "May it be kinder than the truth." They drank as the song ended, as the patrons erupted into applause, as the minstrel bowed and promised more tales tomorrow night. "Perhaps the one about Lord Blackmore and the Dragon of Blackmore Pass." Edric sighed. Torvald grinned. And somewhere, in the space between truth and fiction, the legend lived on.